The Leafs face a tough back-to-back this weekend. So what lineup changes should Sheldon Keefe consider? Should he just keep the lineup the same? We'll discuss that and more on this edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Leafs podcast, your daily things for all things Leafs. I'm your host, David Morassutti from Sportsnet. Just a reminder, the Locked On Leafs podcast is a daily Maple Leafs-centric podcast. So make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. Make sure you also get over to our YouTube channel and subscribe. We are over the 4,800 subscriber mark, which means we are that much closer to 5K subscribers. Trying to give away a jersey once we reach the 5K mark, another jersey giveaway. We know a lot of you people like the giveaway, so make sure you tell all your friends to go and subscribe and get yourselves involved with that. Also, today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And of course, with Mike not here this week, I always go out and reach out to the faves of the show. Guest of, friend of the show, James from Offside Hockey Talk, as always, like he always does, has graciously agreed to come back. James, first off, thank you for coming back. Sometimes people don't like coming back to the podcast.
Anytime, man. Anytime. As long as I'm awake enough to do it, I'm ready to go.
Right. And so this has been an interesting time for the Leafs. Obviously, it's almost like every year when we get to this point, we know the Leafs situation heading into the playoffs. Now, as some people have told me, well, third place isn't a guarantee yet. Fair. I mean, the Leafs would have to go on a massive, downturn to have the Lightning overtake them, because that's really the only team I see right now overtaking the Leafs. And look, 7 points might not seem like a lot, but for the Lightning, they've been so up and down this year. I mean, they've played better of late, 7-2 their last 10. But, I mean, is it the worst thing if the Leafs don't have to play the Atlantic Gauntlet in the first two rounds of the playoffs either?
It might not be. It might not be the worst thing in the world, but you still might have to. Even if you start slipping, you might actually play the Boston Bruins or Florida anyways if you slip far enough down the rankings. So,
yeah. So, I mean, look, you always kind of want to control your own destiny as much as possible, but I don't know. The Metro Division Gauntlet doesn't seem as daunting as the Atlantic Division one, but at the same time, you don't want to put yourself in that wild card situation either. But either way, I don't know if it really makes as much of a difference for the Leafs here. And on top of that, we've been trying to figure out a lot of things about this lineup, what Sheldon Keefe should be looking to do with these, with this stretch of games here. And it doesn't help that back-to-backs, in my opinion, don't allow you to do everything kind of the way you want it, because you got to give guys games off. Guys have been hurt. Guys are getting sick because of the way the scheduling has kind of been done. Flu bugs have been coming around. And we got, obviously, Ilya Lyubushkin. He was dealing with an illness, so that threw the whole blue line into flux. Then we decided to do the TJ Brodie scratching, which was something that a lot of people have been asking for. And we'll get into that a little more in detail a little later in the show, but let's first go and look at this back-to-back here, right? Because I feel like this is a real big test for the Leafs in a lot of ways, because they have been playing different degrees of opponents the last little bit here, right? Yep. Everyone was lauding about that winning streak the Leafs went on with Morgan Rielly out of the lineup. And you know what? Like, I can understand where people were like, yeah, I know the Leafs look pretty good without Morgan Rielly in the lineup. And I'm like, but let's not forget the teams that the Leafs played without Morgan Rielly in the lineup. You had the Blues, the Flyers, the Ducks, the Blues, the Coyotes. That's a far cry for some of the teams that they played lately. The Bruins, they've had the Rangers, they had the Golden Knights a couple of times. Like, to me, a true measure of a team like the Leafs can only be done against the elite, the teams that you know for sure are going to be there at the end, right?
Yep.
And so for me, like I just see this back-to-back with the Oilers and the Hurricanes as like this to me is probably the biggest test other than like the upcoming games against like Atlantic foes like the Panthers, the Lightning. They're done with the Bruins, so it's pretty much the Panthers and the Lightning are the only real playoff teams in the Atlantic division that they're going to be playing against. This upcoming back-to-back against the Oilers and the Hurricanes is huge.
It is huge. But let me just do this. Like, no, the sky is not falling this weekend if the Maple Leafs go 1-1 or, God forbid they go 0-2. You just touched on a lot of things there. There are injuries, there are sicknesses, there are players trying to get back up to speed. There are players that I believe shouldn't be in this lineup or around it at all. And I've taken my heat for that all week, but I'll stand by what I said. But yes, this weekend should be a measuring stick weekend for the Maple Leafs, but also should be a measuring stick weekend for Sheldon Keefe. How do you deploy your lineup against Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl and your former player in Zach Hyman? How do you stack up against the Edmonton Oilers? Who do you put in net? What are your defensive pairings? How do you shuffle your own lineup to respond to theirs to make sure that you are rolling and they are chasing you throughout the game? Because yes, you do have offensive players yourself. Do you heavily load up line one and just try to attack them and jam that down their throat and hope the rest of your lineup can cover up whatever else they have to cover? Or do you sprinkle guys throughout? That is something you have to worry about. And then do you empty your tank Saturday night against the Oilers because everyone's going to be watching the Matthews versus McDavid, the show that is? Or do you save enough in your tank for Carolina the next night? For me, as this is what I would do, I would have Joe Woll in the net against the Edmonton Oilers. From everything that I've spoken to for Mr. Kevin Woodley, the goalie whisperer himself, it seems like Woll still has the advantage number-wise, and the back room numbers or whatever you want to call them, the extra analytics that we don't get to see, he still is edging Samsonov right now. So I would say Samsonov goes Sunday, maybe can atone for his loss against the Carolina Hurricanes, step that up, much like the Flyers did to the Leafs this week. Maybe the Leafs can flip that script and put one on the Hurricanes on a back-to-back. But for me, this, as much as the team needs to show up here, it needs to be a measuring stick for Sheldon Keefe and how he deploys his guys, because this is what it will be in the playoffs. Because other coaches, they move around their lineup around Sheldon Keefe. And Keefe hasn't been always quick to respond or respond at all. We think of Pasternak moving with Boston. We think of the way they deployed Bennett and different players with Florida. Things that get shifted around that Sheldon Keefe didn't respond to. So I want to see this weekend, if he needs to, when push comes to shove, what does he do?
Yeah, I think that's going to be crucial, right? Because we've seen a lot of people say Sheldon Keefe gets outcoached. Sheldon Keefe is not making the right in-game adjustments, or sometimes he's just making too many adjustments, right?
Yep.
And so I kind of want to get a little more into the goaltending. I glad you put your opinion out there, because I kind of want to get a real gauge on the back-to-back, but more so kind of the rest of the season and how games kind of shake out and how the Leafs can kind of really get to that final decision on Samsonov and Joseph Woll here. So we'll do that here next on the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of the Locked On Leafs podcast is brought to you by Indeed. No matter how the last game went, anytime you take the field, you've got a shot at greatness. Give your team the best shot at winning by recruiting more MVPs with Indeed. If you're hiring, you need Indeed, because Indeed is the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place, and it is the only job site where you're guaranteed to find quality applications that meet your must-have requirements, or else you don't pay. Indeed makes it easy to hire great talent. According to ComScore, Indeed is the #1 job site worldwide, and it delivers 4 times more hires than all other job sites combined, according to Talent Nest back in 2019. Join more than 3 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent. Start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/lockedon. Offer valid through March 31st. Go to Indeed.com Indeed.com/lockedon to claim your $75 credit before March 31st. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire. You need Indeed. Welcome back to the Locked On Leafs podcast. Here, David Morassutti. Joining me today is James from Offside Hockey Talk. Mike is still on vacation, likely back on Monday. We are still working out the details on when exactly he's back. So James might have to do a double duty for this week, and he's always glad.
Always around.
And so when we're talking a little bit about the goaltending situation, because I feel like, again, when you're looking at this Leafs team, because playoff positioning could potentially change, but it's everyone's kind of feel like it's mostly set, or they're going in a certain trajectory. Other things kind of go, in a different more things go into the purview, right, of more importance in terms of what to discuss. We hadn't really heard about the goaltending situation until a few weeks ago, right? Yep. Samsonov was doing so well. He's the guy. There's still a segment of people, I would probably put myself in that segment of people that said, like, don't rule out Joseph Woll right away. I understand the injury kind of put him behind the 8 ball a little bit here. I also know that, when he came back, he wasn't winning. Samsonov was winning. But again, I stress this, that who Joseph Woll played out of his first 2 games back, like, you put him against the Boston Bruins, arguably the worst games I've seen the Leafs play in that stretch of time. Like, they played different against the Bruins than they did against those other opponents. Joseph Woll, would you like to have seen him steal a game for you? It's very hard to steal a game against the Boston Bruins, ladies and gentlemen. Like, that's tough. And look, in the playoffs, you're probably going to need that. But he's also coming back from a pretty lengthy absence. He needs time to get himself back into shape, right? And what we saw against the Washington, like, look at how he played against the Washington Capitals. To me, that was not an easy game because he didn't see a lot of puck, which good for the defense for limiting the Capitals' chances at 5-on-5. The power play goals that he allowed to Ovechkin, like, the goals he allowed weren't of, like, you could see a case to be made that he could have made saves, but also it's Ovechkin. Like, how are you going to stop?
There's been goalies for how many years now since Ovechkin came in the league that aren't stopping that. That's the reason why it's called The Office, and that's the reason why he's about to break Wayne Gretzky's goal record, because he just scores those goals. And also the one off the elbow for Woll too. I mean, that was a little bit fluky, bad luck, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so we're and a lot of people always kind of feel like if Sheldon Keefe goes with one goaltender, and Mike and I have had this conversation before, and I can understand the reasoning. Like, the Leafs coming off that lengthy 4-game absence, the goalie they went with off the absence is the one that we feel like has the inside track. And look, there's a lot of reason to believe that. I think, maybe it's the coach kind of sending a little bit of a message to those 2 guys. Like, I'm going to go with this guy because I feel like right now he's the guy that we want to go with. To me, though, it's hard to make that determination right now because I think they still want to push Joseph Woll a little bit here. And in my opinion, when you see the 2 goalies in the net, Joseph Woll just, and I've heard it so many times, that Joseph Woll just has a different demeanor about him. And coaches are always picky about that, right? Go with the guy that makes you a little more comfortable. Do you feel like that could be the case here with Joseph Woll over Ilya Samsonov?
It is 100%. Also, what does Joe Woll have that Ilya Samsonov does not next season?
A contract.
Mm-hmm.
A really good contract too.
Who do you want to make sure feels happy, confident, comfortable, and just knows that he has a crease? You probably want that to be Joe Woll. Now, the other argument can be made that Samsonov is going to play his you-know-what off because he wants to make sure he earns top dollar if he is going to be a UFA in the market, which, hey, someone may pay him. But by the way, guys, 31 other teams passed on this guy on the waiver wire. And we all know his stats since then. He's been pretty lights out. So any team would have loved to have had this guy. And the argument about, the salary, teams find a way to make salary work if they want someone. Look at the Vegas Golden Knights. Hi, cheaters. How you doing? That's That literally is my thoughts on them. I'll leave it there. But for me, I think Joe Woll is the starter for this team for a very long time. Anyone I spoke with who dabbles in goaltending or, is with goaltenders, which some people I've talked to are with Joe Woll. And they speak high of this guy. His preparation is high. Even when he was injured, constantly in the video room, watching all of his plays, the goals that he allowed. Where did he mess up? Where was his angle wrong? Where was this wrong? Why wasn't his arm here when it should have been here? And just a huge student of the game, always adding more tools to his toolbox and watching different goaltenders and what they do and how he can add that to his game. But the other part of it is, too, he's not on social media. He doesn't allow the noise to get to him. And he also is very calm, cool, and collective as a person. And that bodes well. And again, I'll go back to Carey Price when he was asked about Joe Woll, and he said he reminded him of himself, the way that he carries himself. Mm-hmm. Not so much the play yet, because he hasn't got a chance to do that, but the preparation and the way that he carries himself. So to me, it looks like Joe Woll is the heir apparent for this Crease, and he would be the guy that I would bet to be starting on game one.
Yeah, I mean, and look, I'm not ready to make any sort of determination right now, just because really there's no reason to do that.
Nope.
And look, and some people might think that that's the wrong thinking. Like, ride with a guy, let a guy feel like he has the net. In a way, here though, like Samsonov has played better when I feel like again he has to be throw a little motivation under him, right? Let him
work a little harder when someone's nipping at your heels.
Exactly, right? And look, the pressure gets harder in the playoffs. And look at the 2 games he's lost recently. Look at the Hurricane game and Hurricanes game and the Flyers game. 2 games where the pressure really upped, right? The Leafs had that lead against Carolina, and they fell apart late. The Flyers game, the pressure was, oh God, like the pressure in that game. And Samsonov, while you can't fault him for everything that happened in that game, he didn't calm anything down either with his team.
Make that key save at the key moment.
Right. And so there's a little bit of that. And look, Joseph Woll's had that too against the Bruins, where the Leafs are kind of floundering a little bit defensively. He wasn't exactly helping the cause either. So I feel like Sheldon Keefe is trying to get a little bit of a message to these guys that there's one of you guys has got to take this. Right. And so that's kind of how I feel like he's trying with this goaltending situation. So you brought it up. You think put Joseph Woll in night 1 and go with Samsonov night 2. Really, I think it all kind of depends on, do you reward Joseph Woll for the win, or do you say I'm sticking true to a rotation? And to me, I feel like there's no wrong answer here, but we know that it's going to be spun one way or the other if Joseph Woll is named the starter on Saturday.
I say roll with Joe Woll. He won you the game. If you're true to what you're saying about the hot hand goes, then let him heat up. Let him feel more rubber. Let him get more games in. Let him get some stuff under the belt. Because the mistake here, we all know what Ilya Samsonov can do when he's on. The problem with Ilya Samsonov is when he falls off, when he goes through his dip. Right now with Joe Woll, you have a guy that you really haven't got to get on a roll. And the mistake would be not getting him enough starts to get him on a roll for when, if Samsonov, if you decide to make that your guy, goes on a dip, and then Woll hasn't played that many games, and you're like, hey, playing the playoffs. How'd that go last year? Right? Can he do it? Probably. Will he fumble a little bit? Probably. But if you give him more chances and more starts, this guy is one of those goaltenders that just gets it and clicks. And I think this would be the right way to do it. Reward him for Saturday, play Samsonov on Sunday so he can redeem himself against the team he lost. It writes itself. If you beat the Oilers, Joe Woll's a hero. Everybody loves it. Samsonov beats the Carolina Hurricanes. He atoned for his loss. Both guys are now battling. Now there's a goalie controversy in Toronto, and every media station gets to talk about it till the next game because that's what will happen, including us.
Oh, no, exactly, right? And so the Leafs only have 2 sets of back-to-backs after this.
Yep.
So, and they don't have like a lot of those breaks in between games either. So you could truly do a rotation here. But as some people like to say too, is you kind of want to see one goaltender get 3 in a row, right? Kind of see. It's always tough to go one after the other. You can't that's always tough for a goaltender because, they play one game, they play so well. Now I got to wait 4 days before I make my next start. So I do think there should be also a case where Sheldon Keefe should say in the period where there's no back-to-backs, let's give one guy 3 in a row. And he kind of did that with Samsonov. Even Samsonov had 4 in a row.
Yeah,
before,
give him a runway to run with it. See what you do.
I think Joe Woll is deserved. I think he is deserved to at least get that opportunity, just because we saw what he did in the playoffs last year.
Mm-hmm.
We seen what he did when Samsonov was not himself.
Off, and Joe Woll was amazing. Him and Jones, but
Yeah.
Joe Woll really showed that when the team is not at its best, he can be a guy that stands on his head. And for whatever everybody says online that goalies don't steal games, I beg to differ, because that game against Ottawa before he got hurt, he was stealing that game. He was lights out. The saves he made had no business making. And I mean, if he can do that in a playoff game and just stone cold, if the Leafs are having a moment, man, that's what you need. You need a goalie to make those key saves in key moments. And he can do that, where I don't have the same confidence in Samsonov. I just don't.
Yeah. I've always seen a different mentality when it comes to Joseph Woll and that comment to me. And you mentioned Carey Price. I didn't even think about that. But like when you look back how Carey Price played in goal, he was very much, he would make that extra effort to make a save, but he was not erratic. I think
it wasn't scrambly. It was positionally done.
It was positionally done, and it was just calm, cool, and collective, right? So, yeah, I think there's definitely a case. It's going to be probably the biggest storyline, in my opinion, to watch down the stretch here. That's why, if people are wondering why we talk so much about the goaltending in the playoffs makes or breaks so many teams. Florida does not go to the Cup final if Sergei Bobrovsky does not go through the Russian gas moment of just absolutely lighting everything. Like he had his Carey Price moment. Carey Price with the Habs. They don't get to that Cup final without Carey Price basically ending his career to get them there.
Yeah.
You look at even Aiden Hill with the Golden Knights. I could give you enough goaltenders. Matt Murray when he was with the Penguins.
Confer.
There's enough goaltenders, enough stories to go around to show that, yes, you need to play a certain way in the playoffs, but if you got a goaltender, makes all the world of difference. So, again, can be a very crucial storyline to follow between now and the rest of the season. There are still more storylines with this team to follow, especially on the lineup, how the lineup's going to look, who stays, who's going to be sitting upstairs in the press box, because there's still going to be some of that decision. So we're going to discuss that more. We're going to take a quick break, though, here on the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. And guess what? Some of you might have already had a busted bracket if you bet on Kentucky tonight. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on spreads, money lines, or you can even pick who's going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoop until they cut the nets down. Welcome back to the Locked On Leafs podcast. David Morassutti here, and of course, James from Offside Hockey Talk. If you haven't followed James on X, you should be going to do that. You can follow him there at Offside Talk. You're about 3 times a week. You're doing your live shows.
2 or 3 times a week, yeah. Whenever we can get him in right now, but 2 times for sure.
Yeah, so it's always great. Great conversations. He's always and look, you do them live. I always give you extra credit for doing those live. It's not easy to do those live, because you can make mistakes, like I've made mistakes, and just do a little of the cut, trim, fix that. But going, if you want to get into that more of that discussion, James is always open to it, and he will debate you. I do know, and it's good debates, because debates are the only ways that you can truly understand and truly grasp the different scenarios, right? The different ways that teams are put together. Like, there's never one correct formula to building a team, right? And sometimes coaches will say, you know what? This guy has been good for us for years. We're going to stick with him. I feel like that's something Sheldon Keefe was doing with TJ Brodie. And look, TJ Brodie has been a trooper since he signed in Toronto. I remember everyone was talking about Alex Pietrangelo that year. He was the guy. He was the top guy in free agency. Leafs don't get him. What was the move that came almost right after? TJ Brodie, signed by the Leafs. And people were like, TJ Brodie. First off, he wasn't a right shot. He was leaving Calgary at a time where, you were kind of wondering, can this guy be a top 4? Well, even like a top pair guy. What does he do? He comes, he plays on the right side with Riley. Worked out pretty well as a left shot on the right side. Not easy to do. Which is why when you heard Sheldon Keefe say, we've asked him to do more than we expected, it was almost like he knew that he was making the right decision to sit him down. It was painful, but he also tried to kind of soften the blow a little bit. Is that the sense you got when you saw that Sheldon Keefe presser when he?
No, it definitely was, and they tried to make it so TJ Brodie kind of like you're landing on pillows, basically. Like, hey, we've asked the world of this guy. Yeah. He stepped up every single night. He doesn't complain. He plays where we put him. And we all know the best version of TJ Brodie earlier this season was him playing on his actual side where he's comfortable and put up some of his best, most respectable numbers we've seen in the past couple of seasons. But yeah, Sheldon Keefe definitely wanted to lessen that blow. But we also have to remember this guy has some serious off-ice things happening too among his family, and more concerningly his wife. And they ran that on Sportsnet. Go watch it. Beautiful video they put together of them talking about everything happening. But you have to remember that weighs heavily on him too. And whatever physical ailments he has playing a full NHL season, to me, it was the right decision to sit him a long time ago. And not just because of the play, but let this guy's body heal. But also let up here take a moment and just calm the noise and really absorb all that's going on around you. And remove yourself from just the on-ice day-to-day play. Still practice, still be around the team, but that other part of it, to me, is very crucial. Between the ears, we hear that a lot from different players and coaches and management. Between the ears is where that needs to be fine-tuned, or he needs to focus on that. We heard a lot this year about Ilya Samsonov. Between the ears is the problem right now. I think for TJ Brodie, not only the noise of his play, but just the noise of his own life right now. Sit this guy. They look good against Washington with what they had in there. You can mix in Lyubushkin. Sit this guy. Let him get everything on track. And I think you'll get a revitalized Brodie for when you need him the most. And you can play him on the side he should be playing on. That's just my 2 cents. But I think Keefe, knowing all he knows about this player from every aspect, that's why he approached it that way. Because he does have a tremendous amount of respect for TJ Brodie. And for any Leaf fan to sit there and say they were upset the day he signed, you're full of it, because we all loved it. We loved the first 2 seasons of what he brought. It's just been the tail end of last season and this one that's been, let's just say what it is, disappointing.
I think the big one here too for TJ Brodie is sometimes you just need a game to just sit up there and kind of reflect and see the game a little differently too, right? We constantly hear, look, John Tortorella one game last year said, I'm not going to be on the bench. I'm going to be up there. I'm going to be upstairs. He didn't have to do it. No, I've never seen an NHL coach do that before. It's a different perspective and you kind of see things a different way, right? I think for Brodie too, I think you're like, we talked, you mentioned it. A lot has been thrown at this guy. And people might say the personal stuff is the personal stuff, but when somebody that close to you dealing with that, you're kind of feeling a little helpless and being able to help them. It weighs. Like he's still a person at the end of the day, right? That stuff does weigh. It makes you. It's hard to kind of turn your brain off, focus on one thing when you've got that in the back of your mind. So I think that plays a factor too. Like Sheldon Keefe didn't specifically mention it, but I think he kind of implied it a little bit when he was saying a lot has been thrown at Brodes, as he mentioned it. And look, And I'm a little, what disappoints me about Brodie is, Sheldon Keefe puts him with Morgan Riley. I would like Morgan Riley to kind of lift up TJ Brodie a little bit here, but I'm also at the same time at like he's been doing it it hasn't worked for a few years. They've always found they had to make a trade to bring somebody else into play with Riley, and to me that's just a little bit of a Sheldon Keefe thinking he has that safety blanket, but it's not a safety blanket.
There was a point in time where TJ Brodie was the guy you paired everyone with to calm their game down. That was a true factor. He used to be that guy. Right now, he's not. And he's not the red line and back kind of guy that you need. That's why Lyubushkin works with Riley. That's why I think Benoit would work with Riley. That's why Luke Shen worked with Riley. They understood their role, red line and back, keep it simple, and let Mo do his thing, but make sure you're ready to get back and defend from the red line and back and in front of your net. Brodie doesn't have the in front of the net stuff, and his stick hasn't been as active as we've seen. So,
like, what has made TJ Brodie such an effective player? Because he's not very overly physical.
Nope.
I'm not saying he doesn't hit at all, but he does not. He's not that Benoit McCabe that's gonna throw guys from the front of the net. He's a positional guy. Mm-hmm. He is. I'm going to break up the chances before they happen, but because the skating isn't totally there, because the physicality isn't there. He's put in a tough spot here, especially against upper echelon competition where, you know what? The Simon Benoit works a little bit better because the skating is there. He's proven to be a little more mobile than I think people give him credit for, and the physicality is there, right? And so I think what this shows is Sheldon Keefe shouldn't feel bad if come playoff time, if TJ Brodie is not part of your best 6 defensemen, shouldn't be in the lineup.
I think TJ Brodie, if you limit his minutes and put him in a more sheltered kind of role, it's a 5-6 penalty killing defenseman. You get the best version of TJ Brodie at the tail end of his contract. That's the other part of it too, right? I think that is just utilizing your players the proper way and playing them to their strengths. And where would his strength be? I think in that position. Not elevated minutes, and I wouldn't want to call them limited minutes, but key minutes.
Yeah.
So he's not always on the ice. He's not taxed. Just my 2 thoughts on it.
So my question, the final one here is, does this mean having somebody else play, right, like a Benoit, or does it mean maybe whoever he's paired with, that doesn't get the same usage, right? Like, do you use an Edmondson Liljegren pairing a little bit more in certain cases, right? Do you use a Benoit McCabe pairing a little differently? Like we already know that Brodie is probably only going to be playing with McCabe from now. Like I think that's the only pairing that I can see really happening, unless Sheldon Keefe changes something drastically where maybe Edmondson gets a few games with McCabe and Brodie plays with Liljegren. Like I feel like unless something changes here, it's almost like Brodie and McCabe are going to have to be the duo. And then Sheldon Keefe is going to have to really decide if that's the best way to use Jake McCabe. Because if you're playing Jake McCabe, you're playing him a lot. You're playing him against tougher competition. And maybe you're not going to get the most out of him because Brodie might not be able to handle that.
No, it just boils down to the fact of who's the best players at the current time, right? Who's your best compilation of guys? And we've all been screaming for Benny to be in the lineup, and he proved us all right. He should be in that lineup. The other guy that's on the bubble for me is Timothy Liljegren. Does he have the physical wherewithal yet? He's growing into it, by the way. I think his game has come a little bit of a next step. Not the full step we wanted this season, but it's starting to take that step with more reps. But in the playoffs, I think TJ Brodie would be more suited as your 5-6 guy than Timothy Liljegren would be. Just my 2 thoughts on that. Just a hockey IQ. And again, if you use him as a limited player, bottom pair, penalty kill guy, I think Brodie outtakes Liljegren, to be honest with you.
My final question here for you too. Are you more because it seems like Sheldon Keefe is more inclined to keep the right shot in. Do you give Connor Timmins a little bit of a go too? Right? Like we've seen Connor Timmins get back into action against the Capitals, but then you're like, he didn't look bad, but is it also a case of how he was playing and who he was deployed against?
No, man, he looked. But again, this is what I was talking about. Nick Robertson was right. Timon got in, and he made the most of his ice time. He made himself noticeable with smart plays and good plays that led to chances. Or defensively, he was sound. He was doing things away from the puck that you need a guy to do. That's another option, right? That's another option for the Maple Leafs to maybe shake it up. And maybe that is where Brodie sits. Or maybe Liljegren sits. You let these other guys come back in. You also have to think Giordano's skating. So he's going to want to be in the mix too. So you have a lot of NHL-ready defensemen that can play on this squad. But yeah, Connor Timmins to me is definitely a guy I would mix in. And I would expect you to see down the stretch here getting more games.
A big one here to me, and I kind of said it on the show yesterday, which is there's a reason why everyone says you need to be 8 defensemen deep come playoff time. Injuries can happen at a drop of a pin, right? You need to make sure the other guys are capable and ready to play in that moment, right? And so for me, you need to get Connor Timmins to play a few games. And this is where you get a Jake McCabe a night off. This is where you get a TJ Brodie a night off, because you do need to see if the other guys can play and not just play a back-to-back situation or against a lower opponent, play them against a good team. Now, I'm not saying do it if you're on the bubble of the playoffs and you
roll your best lineup at all costs.
Let's say the Leafs get a little bit of breathing room here and can afford in a game against the Panthers to throw Connor Timmins in. I say you got to do that, because other teams, you know what? This is where I'm kind of on the fence with Sheldon Keefe, where other teams are willing to give those guys opportunities. Other coaches feel like I got to trust these guys. Sheldon Keefe, to me, it's the trust factor that really bothers me sometimes. He doesn't trust some of his players. He's come out and he's said it before. And to me, you need to show as a coach you trust the guys you're putting in the lineup. Otherwise, if they don't have that confidence, you're going to get the result that most of the time happens when guys are not ready for the moment.
No, I fully agree with you. 100%. And listen, this may be the deepest D-core the Leafs have. Maybe not the most skilled, but I would say the deepest they've had with NHL-ready named defensemen sitting in the wings, waiting to jump in on an injury. So I don't know. It looks good for the Maple Leafs this season. Playoff-wise, I'm excited for the road to be done and the playoffs to begin.
Definitely. So we'll be come back. The next time you see us on the airwaves, we'll be talking about the Leafs and how they did in their back-to-back against the Oilers and the Hurricanes. Just a note that the Sunday game against the Hurricanes is at 6 o'clock. It is not the normal 7 o'clock start time. So if you tune in at that time, you're going to miss part of that game. So make sure you guys keep a note of that when you're watching your Leafs this weekend. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube and hit the notification, because when we publish our video, you will get a notification when it's up, so you don't miss it when it drops. Make sure you go and you do that. We'll discuss the hopefully a couple of Leafs wins against the Oilers and the Hurricanes. Until then, keep it locked right here on Locked On Leafs.